The day Myrtle Garrison walked into Caldwell, Kansas, she owned nothing but the dress on her back and a name that was only half her own. It was the summer of 1878, and the prairie stretched out in every direction like a golden sea that had forgotten how to move. The sun hammered down on the main street of Caldwell with the kind of heat that made men squint and horses stomp. And in the middle of all that shimmering misery, Myrtle walked barefoot on the packed dirt road because her shoes had given out 3 miles back near the creek crossing. She was 22 years old, her dark hair was tangled from 2 days of walking, and the pale blue dress she wore had been mended so many times in so many places that the original fabric was almost an afterthought. There were patches on the hem and patches on the sleeves, and a careful row of stitches along the collar where it had torn against a fence post somewhere back in Indian Territory. She had no wagon. She had no horse. She had no money and no luggage and nothing in her hands but the small determination that had kept her feet moving since she had left the farm outside of Wichita, where she had been working as a hired girl since the age of 15. Garrison was the name of the family who had taken her in when she was 7, after her mother died of fever and her father walked away from everything he had ever been and never came back. The Garrisons were decent people in the way that decent people sometimes are. They fed her and clothed her and worked her hard and called her one of their own, but they never formally adopted her and never gave her any legal standing. And when their eldest son Clement returned from 2 years in Missouri with a wife and ambitions, there was no longer room in the house or the arrangement for a girl with no paperwork and no blood claim. They had given her $5, a blessing, and a gentle push toward the road. So Garrison was the name she carried, the way a traveler carries a borrowed coat, grateful for the warmth, uncertain of the ownership. Caldwell was a cattle town, sitting right on the edge of the Kishom Trail, and in the summer of 1878 it was alive with the particular chaos of a place where cowboys from Texas came to end their long drives and celebrate with spectacular and often regrettable enthusiasm. The saloons were busy. The hotels were full. The general store had a line that stretched out the door, and the smell of cattle and horses and unwashed men and frying meat hung over everything like weather. Myrtle stood at the edge of town for a long moment, taking all of it in, trying to decide which direction was the one most likely to lead to a meal and a place to sleep. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily, but she was hungry and tired and her feet were bleeding slightly from where the road had been unkind. And there was a moment, just a brief, private moment, where she looked at the whole roaring town and felt something close to despair wash over her. Then she straightened her spine, smoothed the front of the blue dress with both hands, and walked toward the building with a sign that read, "Hardy's Boarding House and Laundry, Respectable Women Welcome." The woman behind the front desk of Hardy's was named Beatrice Hardy, and she was the kind of person who could take in a situation at a glance and render a verdict before the other party had finished walking through the door. She was 50 years old, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair pinned severely above a face that had seen enough of the world to be skeptical of most of it. Beatrice looked at Myrtle, the bare feet, the mended dress, the tangled hair, the careful dignity, and then she asked without preamble, "You looking for work or charity?" "Work," Myrtle said. "I am a hard worker. I can cook and clean and do laundry and mend. I can also keep accounts if you need it." Beatrice raised one iron eyebrow. "You can keep accounts. I can read and write and do arithmetic. The Garrison family schooled me proper." There was a silence in which Beatrice appeared to be conducting some internal negotiation. Then she said, "Room and board and $2 a week. You start with the laundry today, the cooking rotation starts Monday. If I find you to be dishonest or lazy, you are out before the sun sets on the same day." "Understood." "Understood," Myrtle said. That was how she came to Caldwell, and for the first month, that was the whole of her world. The steaming wash basins in the back of Hardy's, the heavy irons, the mountains of sheets and shirts, and work trousers that the cowboys and traveling men left behind. She scrubbed and wrung and pressed and folded, and on Sundays she cooked breakfast for the boarding house guests, and in the evenings she mended whatever needed mending by the light of a candle stub in the small room at the top of the back stairs that Beatrice had given her. She was grateful. She was also lonely in a way that she did not quite have words for, not the loneliness of being alone in a room, but the loneliness of being a person without a fixed place in the world, someone who existed in the margin of other people's stories, rather than at the center of her own. She had been in Caldwell for 5 weeks when she first saw Simon Collier. He came into the boarding house on a Thursday afternoon in late July, and he was not what anyone would call a subtle presence. He was tall, genuinely tall in the way that makes a person seem slightly out of scale with ordinary rooms, with the kind of sun-darkened, work-shaped build that came from 20 years of ranching rather than any particular vanity about his appearance. He was 30 years old, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was always one day past needing a shave, and he wore his good clothes dark trousers, a white shirt that had been pressed by someone who knew what they were doing, a vest of dark wool, in the casual way of a man who wore good clothes, because the occasion required it rather than because he cared about them. His boots were well-made and well-maintained, which was the thing that told you something about who he actually was, because a man who kept his boots in good order had a certain relationship with discipline and detail that went beyond appearances. He took his hat off when he came through the door, which was something not all men remembered to do, and he asked Beatrice Hardy in a voice that was low and direct whether there was a room available for 2 weeks, as he had business in town to attend to. Beatrice, who was not easily impressed by anything, told him the price and the rules with her standard efficiency, and then she called for Myrtle to bring the register from the front room. Myrtle came in from the laundry with soap still on her hands and her hair pinned up beneath a cloth, and she brought the register and set it on the desk, and Simon Collier looked at her in the way that some people look at something unexpected, not impolitely, not predatorily, just with a certain attentiveness, as if the world had just offered him a detail he had not anticipated and he was quietly deciding what to make of it. "Thank you," he said to her, because she had brought the register. "You are welcome," she said, because that was the correct response. And that was the first conversation they had, which lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained nothing remotely remarkable. And yet Myrtle thought about it later that evening in a way that she could not entirely account for. The business that had brought Simon Collier to Caldwell was the matter of buying cattle. He ran a ranch. The Collier spread about 40 miles southwest of town in a stretch of rolling grassland near the Cimarron River that his father had established in 1861. And which Simon had expanded considerably since he had taken it over 7 years ago when his father passed. The Collier Ranch was the largest single cattle operation in that part of Sumner County, a fact that was acknowledged by nearly everyone who knew anything about the cattle business in Kansas, though Simon himself rarely mentioned it. He had somewhere between 800 and 1,000 head of cattle at any given time, 24 hired cowboys who worked the range, a proper barn and bunkhouse, and a house that had 3 rooms more than strictly necessary, and enough good grassland that his cattle generally came through the summer looking fat and healthy, while other ranches suffered. In Caldwell, the word was that Simon Collier was the richest man in the valley, though the valley in question was a generous and informal term for the whole stretch of river grassland between Caldwell and the territorial boundary. He was also, as far as anyone in town could tell, entirely unmarried and apparently unbothered by this fact. What Myrtle learned about Simon Collier she learned in pieces, the way you learn about the weather, by paying a certain kind of peripheral attention. She heard Beatrice Hardy discussing him with the other boarders at breakfast. She overheard conversations in the front room between Simon and the cattle buyers he met with. She noticed that he was unfailingly polite to everyone in the boarding house, to Beatrice, to the other guests, to Myrtle herself, in a way that was neither performative nor unctuous, just the behavior of a man who had been raised to treat people with basic courtesy and had never seen a reason to stop. She also noticed that he noticed her. It was not the kind of noticing that made her uncomfortable. It was quieter than that. It was that he looked at her when she brought coffee to the front room, actually looked at her face, not through her the way some of the guests did, and said thank you as if he meant it. It was that when she was scrubbing the front porch steps on his third day there and he came out to leave for a morning meeting, he stopped and asked, in a genuinely curious rather than patronizing way, whether she had been working at Hardy's long. 5 weeks, she told him, wringing out the brush. You from around here originally? He asked. No, she said. I am from nowhere particularly. She said it lightly because she had had enough time to make peace with it, but the truth of it was still there underneath, solid and a little sharp. He did not say anything dismissive or falsely cheerful. He just nodded, as if she had said something that made complete sense to him. Then he put his hat on and walked down toward the main street, and she watched him go without meaning to. On his 5th day in Caldwell, there was a situation. The situation involved a man named Denton Hare, who was one of the cattle buyers Simon had been in negotiations with, and who had a reputation in town for being a hard dealer and a harder drinker. Denton Hare had a habit, when he had been drinking in the afternoon, of coming around to Hardy's boarding house to look for female company among the working women who passed through Caldwell, and Beatrice Hardy had on several occasions made it clear to him that Hardy's was a respectable establishment, and that this was not the kind of company available there. Denton Hare nodded and agreed, and then came back again the next time he was drinking, because some men are constitutionally resistant to certain kinds of information. On this particular afternoon, Myrtle was alone in the front room sorting linens when Denton Hare came in through the unlocked door, and finding her there, and finding her alone, began to conduct himself in a way that was inappropriate and frightening. He was not violent exactly. He did not touch her, but he stood between her and the door and he spoke to her in a low, ugly way, and Myrtle felt the particular kind of fear that women of that era knew well. The fear of a situation that had no law to protect her and no obvious means of escape. She was reaching for the heavy laundry iron on the shelf beside her, because she was the kind of woman who looked for what was available rather than waiting to be rescued, when the front door opened and Simon Collier came in. He took the situation in at the same speed he appeared to take in most things, quietly, thoroughly, and without unnecessary dramatic response. He looked at Denton Hare. He looked at Myrtle's face, which told him everything he needed to know. He said in the low, direct voice he used for most things, "Hare, step outside." Denton Hare was a large man himself and not accustomed to being told what to do, and there was a moment where he drew himself up and looked like he might argue. But something in Simon's expression, something that was perfectly still and perfectly certain, convinced him that arguing would be a mistake. He went outside. Whatever Simon said to him out there, Myrtle could not hear it clearly, but the conversation was brief and Denton Hare's wagon was leaving the street in front of Hardy's within 10 minutes, and he did not come back to the boarding house again that summer. When Simon came back inside, he looked at Myrtle and said simply, "Are you all right?" She was still holding the laundry iron. She realized this and set it down with a small, involuntary laugh at herself, and the laugh caught in her throat in a way that was not entirely amusement. "I am all right," she said. "Thank you." "I am sorry that happened," he said, and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it specifically, not as a social formula. "It happens," she said, and immediately hated how matter-of-fact she sounded, how accustomed to being a person to whom things like this simply happened. He seemed to hear the thing under what she had said because he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It should not happen." "No," she agreed. "It should not." He nodded and went upstairs to his room, and she finished sorting the linens, and for the rest of that evening she thought about those 3 words, "It should not happen," and the particular quality of the man who had said them. The following Sunday, which was Myrtle's one half-day of rest each week, she went to the edge of town where there was a small bluff overlooking the prairie and sat there for an hour watching the grass move in the wind. It was the closest thing she had to a private place, and she came there when she needed to think. She was sitting there, not thinking about anyone in particular, when she heard boots on the dry ground behind her and turned to find Simon Collier, who was apparently taking a walk in the same direction for his own reasons. He stopped when he saw her, with the instinct of a man who understands that he may be intruding on something. "I apologize," he said. "I did not know anyone came up here." "There is room," she said, because there was, and because she found she did not particularly want him to leave. He sat a courteous distance away from her on the bluff and looked out at the grass, and for a while they were both quiet, which was its own kind of remarkable thing, that the silence between them was not uncomfortable. "You said you are from nowhere particularly," he said, eventually. "That is correct. Do you mind if I ask what that means?" She thought about it. She usually was careful about what she told people, having learned early that a woman with no family history and no last name of her own could invite a certain kind of judgment. But something about the way he asked it, straightforward and genuinely curious, without any sense that he was collecting information to use against her, made her answer honestly. "I was born in Missouri," she said. "My mother died when I was 7. My father left. A family named Garrison took me in. I took their name because it was the name that was given to me, but it is not legally mine and I have no other." She said it the way you read out a list of facts plainly, so there was nothing for him to read between, no softness to poke at. But the facts themselves were what they were, and she felt them the way she always felt them, like a stone she had swallowed and learned to carry. Simon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother came to Kansas from Ohio at 19 with nothing but a trunk that got lost on the river crossing. She always said losing that trunk was the best thing that ever happened to her because it meant she had nothing to protect and could put her whole self into building something new." Myrtle looked at him. "Did she build something new?" "She built the ranch," he said. "She and my father together, but she was the engine of it. She was the one who looked at 40 miles of hard grassland and saw what it could be. And where is she now? She died 4 years ago. Fever, same winter as the big snow." He said it without drama, just the way things were. "She was a remarkable woman." "She sounds it," Myrtle said. They sat a while longer watching the grass, and then he asked if she would like to walk back to town before the light got bad, and she said yes, and they walked back together along the ridge, not touching, not saying much, but with a certain ease between them that had not entirely been there before. After that, they talked more regularly. It was not courtship in any formal sense. There were no callers and no parlor visits and no asking permission from anyone, because Myrtle had no one whose permission was required, and Simon was the kind of man who did things thoughtfully rather than according to formula. It was more that they found reasons to occupy the same space and discovered, each time, that they were glad of it. He told her about the ranch, about the spring calving and the summer drives, about the particular problem of keeping water in the line camps during a dry year, about a stretch of fence along the eastern boundary that needed rebuilding, and the argument he had had with his foreman about the best way to do it. He talked about these things the way a person talks about things they love without being fully aware that they love them, with a kind of involuntary precision and warmth. She told him about her years with the Garrison family, about learning to cook over an open fire because the wood stove had a broken damper for 2 whole years, about the older Garrison son who had taught her to keep accounts when she was 12 because he was lazy and preferred that she do it, about the garden she had kept at the back of the Garrison house that had been, she admitted freely, the thing she had been most sorry to leave. "You garden," he said. "I love to garden," she said. "It is the one thing I am genuinely good at in a way that makes me happy." He looked at her with an expression she was coming to recognize, a kind of focused attentiveness, as if he were making careful note of something. "The house at the ranch has a kitchen garden," he said, "or it did. The woman who kept it left 3 years ago, and it has not been much of a garden since." "That is a shame," she said. "It is," he agreed, and left it there, but she thought about it afterward. His 2 weeks in Caldwell were nearly up before anything decisive happened, and what happened was not dramatic so much as honest. He found her in the boarding house kitchen on a Wednesday evening, the day before he was due to ride back to the ranch, and she was kneeling beside the cold fireplace repairing the brick lining where the mortar had crumbled, using a mix she had made herself from ash and clay that she had learned from one of the older Garrison cousins. She was completely absorbed in what she was doing, humming something under her breath, and she did not hear him come in. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching her, and then he said, "You fix everything, don't you?" She looked up, startled but not displeased to find him there. "When I can," she said. "It seems better than letting things stay broken." He crossed the kitchen and sat on the edge of the work table, which was not quite the thing a guest was supposed to do, but she did not say so. He looked at her with that particular focused look, and then, with the directness that she had come to understand was simply his natural register, he said, "I would like very much to continue talking to you past tomorrow." Her hand stilled on the brick. "You are leaving tomorrow," she said, which was not exactly a response to what he had said. "I am. The ranch needs me back." He paused. "I am also going to be in Caldwell again in September, the fall cattle sales." She looked at him carefully. She was not a woman who played at being uncertain about things she was actually certain about. She had always found that particular kind of pretense exhausting and a little dishonest. "I will be here in September," she said. His expression shifted in the smallest possible way, not a smile exactly, but something that sat just behind a smile, warm and careful. "Good," he said. He left the next morning, and she watched his horse disappear down the Cimarron Road from the front porch of Hardy's, and Beatrice Hardy came and stood behind her and said, with the bluntness of a woman who called everything exactly what it was, "Simon Collier is a good man. His father was a good man too. His mother was better than both of them." "I don't know him very well yet," Myrtle said. "No," Beatrice agreed. "But you will." The 6 weeks between July and September were the longest 6 weeks Myrtle had experienced since the 5 days she had walked from Wichita to Caldwell, and they were long in a completely different way. Not the exhausted, desperate length of hard travel, but the particular stretched-out quality of waiting for something you are not quite sure will arrive. She worked. She cooked and cleaned and kept accounts for Beatrice Hardy, who had discovered that Myrtle's arithmetic was as good as advertised, and had given her the boarding house ledger to manage, which was both a responsibility and a kind of trust that Myrtle felt more than she showed. She saved her wages carefully in a small tin box she kept beneath the floorboard in her room. She wrote letters, one to the Garrison family, one to a girl she had known in Wichita named Clara who had been kind to her, and received one back from Clara that was cheerful and uninformative in equal measure. She also, on her Sunday afternoons, sat on the bluff and looked at the prairie and thought about Simon Collier. Not obsessively, not with the kind of consuming, anxious focus that she recognized would help nobody. She was too practical for that. But she thought about him the way you think about a door you have walked through that has opened onto something unexpected, with a certain awareness that the landscape on the other side was different from the landscape you had been in before. He wrote to her. That was the thing she had not anticipated. The first letter arrived in mid-August, delivered through the post that came into Caldwell twice weekly, and it was addressed simply to Miss Garrison at Hardy's boarding house, which was formal in a way that made something in her chest do something it should not have done over an envelope. The letter itself was 3 pages in a handwriting that was clear and slightly angular, the handwriting of a man who had been taught to write properly and had not practiced it as much as he might have. He wrote about the ranch, about a particularly difficult afternoon repairing the eastern fence, which had apparently been even more complicated than he had told the story of, and about a summer thunderstorm that had moved through the Cimarron country like a freight train and left the grass looking extraordinary afterward. He asked about the boarding house, and whether the kitchen fireplace had held up after her repair work. He said at the end of the letter, with a plainness that was entirely characteristic, that he was glad they had talked and that he was looking forward to September. She sat with the letter in her room for a long time before she wrote back. She wrote about the boarding house, and about a particular sunset she had watched from the bluff, and about finding a wild plum thicket behind the livery stable where she had gathered enough fruit to make a pie that Beatrice Hardy had declared the best thing she had eaten since 1873. She did not say anything directly about being glad he had written, because it seemed unnecessary. The fact of the letter she was writing was its own answer. They wrote back and forth 3 times before September came, and by the time Simon rode back into Caldwell for the fall cattle sales on a cool Wednesday in early September, Myrtle felt she knew him better than she had during the 2 weeks he had actually been present, which was one of the particular and somewhat mysterious gifts of writing things down. He came into Hardy's boarding house in the late afternoon, and this time when he walked through the door and she came to bring him the register, the looking at each other was different from the first time. It was the kind of looking that happens between 2 people who have already said something real to each other, and who are now seeing how much of it is still true in person. It was true. She could see that it was, and she thought he could see the same thing from her. "Miss Garrison," he said, and the formality of it was a small joke between them now, because his letters had started simply with Myrtle 2 letters ago. "Mr. Collier," she said, with a gravity that matched his, and then she handed him the register, and he signed it, and their fingers did not touch but were briefly in proximity to each other, which she was aware of in a way that was slightly absurd and also entirely fine. He was in Caldwell for 3 weeks this time, because the fall sales were a bigger and more complicated affair than the summer purchases, involving more buyers and a fair amount of negotiation, and at least one evening in which the negotiations moved from the stock pens to the saloon, and Simon came back to Hardy's boarding house in the late evening, with the expression of a man who had accomplished something complicated and would rather not discuss it. He took her walking every Sunday afternoon, and on Wednesday evenings, when the business of the day was done, they sat in the small side room of Hardy's boarding house that Beatrice called the parlor and talked until the evening wore thin. He told her more about the ranch, about the hands who worked there, men he talked about with the particular familiarity of someone who knew them and respected them without any pretense that the relationship was other than what it was. He told her about his foreman, a solid and reliable man named Abe Weatherford, who had been with the Collier ranch since Simon's father's time. He told her about the trouble of the previous winter, a hard freeze that had come early and cost him a significant portion of the herd, and the financial reckoning that had followed, which he had navigated by selling off a piece of the eastern range that he had been planning to develop. "That must have been difficult," she said. "It was," he said, without elaboration, which was characteristically him. He did not perform his difficulties, he simply stated them. She told him things she had not told anyone, the way you tell things to someone who has shown you that they will hear them without flinching. She told him about the particular shame of not having a last name that was properly hers, the shame she had learned to carry quietly, but that was there nonetheless. The way it felt when she had to sign documents for Beatrice Hardy's accounts and write Garrison knowing it was borrowed. She told him about the long walk from Wichita and the 3 days she had slept under a cottonwood tree near the creek, because she could not make herself keep walking but could not make herself stop either. He listened to all of it with the attentiveness she had come to expect from him, and when she was done, he said something she had not expected. He said, "You walked 40 miles alone with nothing. That is not a story of someone who has nothing. That is a story of someone who has everything that matters and just needs the rest to be in order." She looked at him for a moment. Something in the back of her throat felt tight. "That is a very kind way to look at it," she said. "It is also an accurate way," he said. On the last Sunday of his visit, he asked her to marry him. He did not do it dramatically. He did not do it on one knee or with elaborate preparation. They were walking along the bluff in the late afternoon with the fall light making everything golden and slightly heartbreaking the way fall light does, and he stopped walking and turned to look at her, and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to be honest with you about what I am asking before I ask it, so you have the full picture." "All right," she said. "The ranch needs," he began, and then stopped himself and started again. "I need. That is the right way to say it. I need a partner. I have been running that ranch alone for 7 years, and I have been good at the practical parts of it, and not as good at the parts that make a life instead of just a livelihood. The house is well built and half empty, and I have not had anyone to talk to in the evenings in longer than I like to admit, and I am telling you this because I want you to know that what I am about to say is not impulsive. I have thought about it clearly, and I know what I am asking." She waited. The wind moved through the grass below the bluff. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I will not dress it up with promises I cannot keep. I can promise you that I will work hard and treat you honestly, and that the ranch is sound and the house is solid. I can promise you that you would have a garden and a proper place and a name that is actually yours." He paused. "That last one. I know that might matter to you, and I want you to know that it matters to me too. Not as a gift I am giving you, as something you would be giving me if you agreed." She stood there in the fall light looking at him, and she thought about the dress, the blue one she was still wearing, the only dress she owned, the one that had been mended in so many places it was almost more mend than original. And she thought about the tin box under the floorboard with its careful savings, and she thought about the years of being a person in the margin of other people's stories. She thought about the way he said it should not happen, which was the most clearly she had understood someone else's moral position in a very long time. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment as if he wanted to be certain he had heard correctly. Then something happened in his face that she had not seen before, a kind of relief and gladness that was less about triumph and more about arrival, as if he had been walking towards something for a while and had just gotten there. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she confirmed. "I will marry you, Simon Collier." He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had done that, and his hand was warm and calloused and entirely certain, and she held it back. The practical matters of the engagement took some weeks to arrange, because Caldwell in 1878 was not a particularly slow-moving place, but marriages required a certain amount of logistics. Simon delayed his return to the ranch to make arrangements, which Abe Weatherford managed his frustration about with the philosophical resignation of a man who had worked for the Collier family long enough to know that certain things were simply going to happen on their own schedule. The county clerk in Caldwell processed the necessary paperwork, and a local minister named Reverend Holt, who served the Methodist congregation, agreed to perform the ceremony. The question of a wedding dress arose, and Myrtle faced it with the direct honesty with which she faced most things. She had one dress. It was blue and mended, and she was not ashamed of it, but she was also clear-eyed enough to recognize that it was not what she would have chosen to be married in if she had had a choice. She did not tell Simon this directly, but Beatrice Hardy, who had eyes and who had been in the business of observing human situations for 50 years, noticed Myrtle looking at the blue dress one evening with an expression that said more than Myrtle would have intended, and she said, without prelude, "Come with me." She led Myrtle upstairs to a room at the top of Hardy's boarding house that Myrtle had never been in, which turned out to be a storage room of considerable size and somewhat mysterious content. Among the trunks and boxes and folded items of various description, Beatrice found a dress wrapped in muslin that she shook out with the briskness of someone revealing something they have known was there for a long time. It was a deep cream color, simply cut, with small pearl buttons at the cuffs and a skirt that moved well, and it fit Myrtle almost exactly with only a small adjustment needed at the waist. Myrtle stood in front of the small mirror and looked at herself in it and felt something she did not immediately have a word for. Something about being seen clearly rather than vaguely. Something about the difference between existing and arriving. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "It was my sister's," Beatrice said in a tone that closed further questions on the subject. "She would have liked you to wear it. She would have liked you for that matter." Myrtle turned from the mirror. "Beatrice," she said. "Thank you." Beatrice Hardy, who did not typically receive expressions of gratitude without deflecting them in some efficient manner, merely nodded and began folding the muslin back with great precision. But her eyes were bright, and Myrtle noticed. The wedding was small and plain and true, which suited both of them. It was a Thursday morning in early October of 1878, and the sky over Caldwell was the particular clean, sharp blue that October brings to Kansas, with a wind that smelled of dry grass and the first suggestion of coming winter. Reverend Holt married them in the small Methodist church on the edge of town, with Beatrice Hardy sitting in the front pew on Myrtle's side and Abe Weatherford, who had ridden in from the ranch 2 days before with an expression of considerable relief at meeting the woman his boss had apparently lost his head over, sitting on Simon's side, along with 2 of the Caldwell cattle buyers who had become something like professional acquaintances over the summer. Simon wore his best dark suit with a new white shirt, and his boots were polished to a state of perfection that Myrtle suspected had required some effort. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk down the aisle in Beatrice Hardy's sister's cream dress, and the expression on his face was the kind that belongs specifically to men who are not given to displays of feeling, and who are therefore all the more transparent when feeling overwhelms their reserve. He looked at her as if she were the most sensible thing that had ever happened to him, which she privately considered to be one of the most romantic things she had ever seen. When Reverend Holt reached the part about names, Simon Lawrence Collier, he looked at her and said her name, Myrtle Garrison, and then a moment later said, with the particular weight that ceremony gives to ordinary words, that hereafter she would be Myrtle Collier. She heard her new name and felt it land somewhere deep and permanent, like a cornerstone being set. Myrtle Collier. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration at Hardy's boarding house. Myrtle's last meal there as a guest rather than a working woman, which felt significant even in its simplicity. Beatrice had made a cake, which was an event in itself because Beatrice Hardy was not a woman who typically engaged in celebratory baking. There were congratulations from the boarders who happened to be present, and Abe Weatherford made a speech that was 3 sentences long and deeply sincere, and Simon looked at her across the table with that warm, careful expression, and she looked back with the sudden startling awareness that she had chosen well and had been chosen well in return. They left Caldwell the following morning. The ride to the ranch took most of the day, because 40 miles across open grassland at a reasonable pace requires a certain amount of time and patience. Simon had brought a second horse for Myrtle, a steady bay mare named Pearl who had a smooth gait and a sensible temperament, which was exactly the right choice for a woman who could ride adequately, but was not experienced enough for anything more complicated. They rode with a pack mule carrying the various things that Simon had acquired in town, and the small amount that constituted Myrtle's personal belongings: the tin box of savings, a few books, the blue dress folded carefully, some practical items she had purchased with 2 months of accumulated wages. The prairie in October was beautiful in the spare, serious way of things that do not perform their beauty but simply have it. The grass had gone to gold and copper and rust, and the Cimarron River, when they crossed it at the ford Simon knew well, was lower than summer but still clear and cold. There were cottonwood trees along the bank, and their leaves were turning, and the light hit them in a way that made Myrtle stop Pearl for a moment just to look. "It is beautiful," she said. "Yes," he said, beside her on his horse, looking at the same thing. "I have ridden across this particular ford probably 300 times, and I still stop sometimes." "That is a good sign," she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "That you still stop, that it still looks like something worth stopping for." She glanced at him. Some people ride past the same beautiful thing so many times they stop seeing it. He was quiet for a moment. I think I might have been doing that, he said, with some things, but I do not plan to anymore. They arrived at the ranch in the late afternoon, and Myrtle's first sight of it was exactly as he had described it: substantial, well-tended, and somehow larger than she had imagined. Spread across the grassland with the Cimarron country stretching out behind it in a way that made the sky seem very wide and very close at the same time. The ranch house was a proper structure, built from stone and timber rather than sod, with a covered porch across the front and a root cellar, and a smokehouse off to one side and a kitchen garden at the back that was, as Simon had said, in a state of considerable neglect, but still had enough bones to it that Myrtle could see immediately what it had been and what it could become. Abe Weatherford had ridden ahead to let the ranch hands know the boss was coming back married, which meant there were 8 cowboys standing around the front of the bunkhouse, with their hats in their hands when Simon and Myrtle rode in, wearing the varied expressions of men who have been told to be presentable and have made what they considered a sincere effort. One of them, a young man of perhaps 20 named Danny Prout, who had the earnest face of someone who had not quite grown into his own seriousness, yet stepped forward and said, with a formality that was clearly rehearsed, "Welcome to the Collier ranch, Mrs. Collier." Myrtle found that she had to breathe carefully for a moment. Mrs. Collier. She had known this was what she would be, but hearing it said out loud in a place that was now hers made something in her chest do something large and necessary. She looked at the young cowboy with his rehearsed welcome and his hat held correctly in both hands and said, "Thank you, Danny. I am very glad to be here." The first weeks at the ranch were the most concentrated learning experience of Myrtle's life since the age of 7, and she had had some concentrated learning experiences. The house needed a certain kind of management that was different from managing a boarding house larger in scale and more complex in its rhythms, organized around the needs of the ranch rather than the needs of paying guests. There were meals to cook for the hands on certain occasions, provisions to manage, accounts to keep, a root cellar to organize for winter, and all of this needed to be understood in relation to how the ranch itself operated and what the cycles of the cattle work required. Simon showed her everything without any of the condescension that might have accompanied such a process. He showed her because she needed to know and because he understood that she was capable of knowing. And when she had questions, he answered them directly. And when she had ideas, he listened to them with the same focused attention he brought to everything. They were 2 people figuring out how to share a life, and it turned out that what made this work was less about romance in the beginning and more about the willingness to figure it out honestly, though the romance was present. It was simply the kind of romance that does not announce itself loudly, but accumulates the way a river runs, quietly, steadily, in one clear direction. It was in the mornings in the kitchen, where Simon would come in from the early chores just as Myrtle was starting breakfast and would pour 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her without being asked, because she drank it and he had noticed. It was in the evenings, sitting on the porch in the last light, where sometimes they talked about the day and sometimes they read in comfortable silence. She had brought her 2 books from Caldwell, and he had a shelf of them in the front room that she was working through with methodical pleasure. It was in the first time he saw the kitchen garden, 3 days after they arrived, when she was already out there in the early morning with a hoe, beginning the work of clearing away the 3 years of neglect, and he stood on the back porch with his coffee and watched her for a long moment before he went out to help without being asked. They worked the garden together that first morning, and there was something about working together on a shared piece of ground that told you more about a person than almost anything else. Their patience with the work, their sense of what mattered, their ability to exist in comfortable proximity without constant conversation. Simon was better at it than he probably thought he was, which she filed away with the other things she was learning about him. In November, they had their first real disagreement. It was about money, which is where most real disagreements live. Myrtle had been keeping the ranch accounts for 3 weeks. Simon had given her the ledger without being asked, having discovered that she could do it, and having the clear-eyed practicality to recognize that she should therefore be the one doing it. And she had found a pattern in the winter supply purchases that she thought was costing them more than it should. She brought it to Simon directly, with the ledger and the figures laid out, and he listened to her analysis, and then said, with a slight stiffness that was the first version of disagreement she had seen from him, that he had been buying winter supplies from the same merchant in Caldwell for 5 years, and had a relationship there that was worth more than a few dollars in either direction. "I am not saying the relationship is not valuable," she said. "I am saying that the relationship is costing you approximately $40 more a year than buying from the Hutchinson merchant would. And a relationship that costs $40 a year is still a relationship, just a slightly different one." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it. "You are right," he said finally. "I know," she said. And then, because she did not want to win a point without acknowledging the thing that deserved acknowledging, she added, "And the relationship is worth preserving. I thought we could propose a different arrangement with the Caldwell merchant that keeps the connection without the surplus cost." He looked at her. The stiffness in him had eased and been replaced by something that was partly amusement and partly something warmer. "You had the solution before you brought me the problem," he said. "I thought it would be polite to bring the problem first," she said. He laughed a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from being genuinely surprised and pleased by something, and she had been waiting for that laugh without fully knowing she was waiting for it, and when it came it was better than she had anticipated. "Myrtle Collier," he said, shaking his head slightly. "Simon Collier," she returned with the same inflection. And that was when it shifted, or perhaps when it was fully visible for the first time. The thing that had been building between them since the bluff in Caldwell and the letters and the fall light on the Cimarron Ford. The ease and the substance of it. The particular quality of being with someone who sees you accurately and is glad of what they see. He kissed her that evening for the first time, not impulsively, not dramatically, but deliberately and gently on the porch in the dark with the prairie stretched out before them, and the stars very large and clear. The way stars are in Kansas in November when the air has gone cold and clean. She kissed him back with equal intention, and afterward they stood together for a long time looking at the stars, his arm around her shoulders and her head tilted slightly toward him, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. The first winter at the ranch was hard in the way that Kansas winters were hard. Not catastrophically, not with the violence of the winter he had described that had cost him part of his herd, but with the steady, relentless difficulty of cold and wind and work that did not stop because the weather was unpleasant. Myrtle found out things about herself she had not entirely known, that she could function very well in cold conditions, and that she had a natural affinity for the particular organizational work of keeping a ranch household through a winter, laying in fuel and food, and the 100 small domestic preparations that kept people alive and functional in the hard months. She liked the work in a way she had not expected to like it. She liked having a place that was hers to tend. She also liked the cowboys who worked the ranch, in the careful and appropriate way that a ranch wife develops regard for the men who keep the operation running. Abe Weatherford she admired from the start. He was solid and competent, and had a dry sense of humor that emerged slowly and was all the better for it. Danny Prout, who was 20 years old and trying earnestly to be equal to the ranch's demands, became something of an unofficial fixture in the ranch house kitchen on cold evenings, because Myrtle fed people when they were cold, and Danny was frequently cold and hungry with the appetites of a young man who was working very hard and had been doing his own cooking in the bunkhouse all winter. Simon noticed this and approved of it in his quiet way. He had a certain feeling about the ranch as a place where people were properly taken care of, and it gave him something to see Myrtle extending that quality outward naturally. They had an unexpected visitor in February of 1879. His name was Henry Garrison, the eldest son of the Garrison family from Wichita, who was traveling through the area on business and had heard, somehow, that Myrtle had ended up at the Collier ranch. He arrived on a cold afternoon looking somewhat sheepish and also genuine in the way that people look when they have come to say something that they are not entirely sure will be received well. He told her that the family thought about her often, that his mother particularly had never quite been at peace with how things had gone, and that he had wanted to find her and say so. He also told her haltingly, with the honest awkwardness of a man making a long-overdue acknowledgement, that they should have done better by her, that she had deserved better, and that he was sorry. She was quiet for a moment after he said this, sitting in the ranch house kitchen with the coffee she had made him and the January light coming through the window, and she thought about the girl who had walked away from the Garrison farm with $5 and a borrowed name, and she thought about where that girl was now. "I have a name," she said simply, "and a place, and a good man. I am not angry with you, Henry." He nodded, visibly relieved, and then looked around the kitchen and at the house beyond it and said, "You have done well." "We have done well," she corrected, because it was true, and because she wanted it to be exactly true. Simon came in from the barn in the middle of the visit and shook Henry Garrison's hand with the uncomplicated welcome of a man who had no particular reason to be hostile to the people from Myrtle's past, because her past had led her here, and he was grateful for the whole of it. Henry had supper with them and left the next morning, and Myrtle watched his horse disappear down the Cimarron road and felt the last loosely hanging thread from her previous life tuck itself into place. Spring came with the usual combination of relief and immediate overwhelming work, and with it came the full revelation of what the kitchen garden could be. She had cleared and turned the beds in the fall and amended the soil with material from the compost she had started in September. And in March, she started seeds in shallow boxes on the kitchen windowsill and watched them come up with the same satisfaction she had felt in the Garrison garden at age 12, when she first understood that you put something in the ground, and it became something larger and more complex. In April, she transplanted what was ready into the garden beds that she had expanded beyond their original boundaries, taking in a new section of ground on the south side where the sun was best. Simon watched her work the garden with a consistent attentiveness that she eventually identified as something more than general interest in what she was doing. One evening in late April, sitting on the back porch after supper watching her assess the progress of the bean seedlings in the last light, he said, "I want to say something and I want to say it correctly." She looked at him. "All right. I asked you to marry me and I told you the honest reasons," he said. "The ranch, the partnership, the practical realities. I told you because I respect you enough to be honest about things, but I want you to know that those were never the whole of it, even then. There was something else that was simpler and less organized and much more important." She waited. "I wanted to be with you," he said. "Specifically you, not someone competent or someone practical, though you are both of those things beyond any expectation. You, Myrtle. The person who sits on a bluff and watches the grass and who fixes the fireplace with homemade mortar, and who writes letters about wild plum pie as if it is the most interesting thing that has happened in 3 weeks, which I found, when I read that letter, it somehow was." He paused. "I love you. I should have said it before now, and I am saying it now." She felt the words settle into her the way a good meal settles, with warmth and substance and the sense of something essential being met. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while." "How long?" he asked. She considered. "Probably since you told Dent and Hare to step outside and then came back in and said it should not happen," she said. "That was when I thought this is a man who could be worth knowing." He looked at her. "That was 5 weeks into knowing each other." "Yes." "And you didn't say anything for months." "Neither did you," she pointed out. He laughed, and she laughed with him, and then he reached across the porch bench and took her hand in his, and they sat together in the spring evening, watching the garden settle into the soft dark. The following years had the texture of something well-made, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary challenges of life on a working ranch in the 1880s, but with a fundamental soundness to them that came from two people who had built something real together and knew it. In the spring of 1880, their first child was born, a boy, which was announced by Simon Collier with the stunned and delighted expression of a man who has been told something wonderful and is not yet sure he deserves it. They named him Thomas Lawrence Collier, Thomas for no particular named ancestor, but because both of them liked the sound of it, and Lawrence for Simon's father. And Thomas from the first week made his opinions about the world entirely clear, and proved to be a child of extraordinary determination, who would not sleep unless held, and who had, from the earliest age, a fixed and particular interest in horses that seemed to precede any ability to actually ride one. Simon held the baby in the ranch house kitchen on the third day after he was born, and looked at him with an expression that Myrtle had never seen on him before, a kind of absolute openness, a vulnerability that was entirely without defense, and she thought, watching them, that she was seeing something she would remember exactly for the rest of her life. "He is remarkable," Simon said, which was not an unusual thing to say about a newborn, but which he said as if it were a plain, factual observation. "He has your jaw," she said. "God help him," Simon said, which made her laugh and made Thomas protest the vibration of the laugh by scrunching his face in a way that was both ridiculous and entirely sovereign. The ranch in those years was doing well. Simon's careful management and Myrtle's reorganization of the household accounts and provisioning had resulted in a steady improvement in the operation's efficiency, and the herd had grown. In 1881, they added 2 more cowboys to the payroll and a proper ice house, which was something Simon had been wanting for several years. In the winter of 1882, when Thomas was old enough to be set down on the floor of the barn to watch the horses with the fascinated intensity of a small scientist observing his primary subject, they repaired and expanded the bunkhouse, which Abe Weatherford declared to be an improvement 40 years overdue. Myrtle's garden by this time had become a genuine and substantial thing, large enough to supply the ranch house through the winter with preserved vegetables, large enough to have a cutting section for flowers, large enough that she had begun growing from seed varieties she ordered through the post from a nursery in Missouri that she had read about in a magazine borrowed from Beatrice Hardy during one of their twice-yearly visits to Caldwell. Beatrice had come out to the ranch once, on a carefully arranged visit in September of 1880, and had stood at the edge of the kitchen garden with the expression of someone revising upward an estimate they had already considered generous. "You built this," Beatrice said. "From the bones of what was here," Myrtle said. "The bones were good." Beatrice had looked at the garden and then at the house and then at Simon, who was crossing the yard toward them with Thomas on his hip in a perfectly unself-conscious expression of domestic contentment. "He was always a good man," Beatrice said quietly, "but he is better now." "So am I," Myrtle said. In the fall of 1883, their second child arrived, a girl this time, with red gold hair that belonged to no one either of them could account for, and a temperament that was the precise opposite of Thomas's determined certainty. Where Thomas approached the world with fixity of purpose, their daughter Frances approached everything as if it were an interesting question that deserved thorough investigation before any conclusions were drawn. She was curious about everything, about the garden, about the horses, about the accounts ledger that Myrtle kept on the kitchen table, about the stars that her father named for her on clear evenings from the porch, pointing each one out with the patience of a man who had been waiting his whole life for someone to want to know these things. Thomas adored Frances from the beginning in the somewhat proprietary way of older siblings, showing her things and then being mildly aggrieved when she turned out to be independently competent at them. Frances found this more interesting than annoying, which told you something about her fundamental good nature. Danny Prout, who was now 25 and a senior hand on the ranch, had in the intervening years become something like a younger brother in the general feeling of the household. Not formally, nothing was ever stated, but in the way that lives spent in close proximity developed their own organic structures. He was a serious and decent young man who worked hard and never caused trouble, and Myrtle had been feeding him at the kitchen table on cold evenings for so long that it had simply become a feature of how the ranch operated. In 1884, a situation arose that had more complexity to it than the ordinary difficulties of ranch life. The Kansas legislature that year passed new fence laws related to the management of public grazing lands, and the effect on ranchers in Sumner County was significant and not uniformly good. Simon's ranch was large enough and well-established enough that the legal situation was manageable, but several of the smaller operations in the area were facing genuine difficulty, including an older rancher named Eli Crane, who ran about 150 head on a piece of land adjacent to the Collier Range, and who was 62 years old and had been ranching in Kansas since before the war. Eli Crane had, in the mathematical reality of the new fence requirements, more fence to build than he had money to build it with, and the fine structure for noncompliance was such that he was looking at losing his grazing rights entirely if he could not remedy the situation by the following spring. Simon heard about this from Abe Weatherford, who had it from one of the men who came to town. He was quiet about it for 2 days in the way he was quiet about things that were occupying his thinking, and then one evening at supper he put his fork down and said to Myrtle, "I am thinking about the Crane situation." She had been thinking about it too. She said so. "I could lend him the money for the fence," Simon said, "or supply the labor and materials. We have the hands and the lumber is coming from Hutchinson already for the new corral." "He would need to accept help," she said. "Men like Eli Crane can find that difficult." "I know. I have been thinking about how to propose it in a way that makes it a practical arrangement between neighbors rather than charity." This was the thing about him that she had come to understand was central to who he was, the consideration of how to do the right thing in a way that preserved the other person's dignity. It was not sentimentality. It was a kind of fundamental respect for people that shaped everything he did. She helped him think through the language of the proposal, and he went to see Eli Crane the following week, and after a conversation that lasted 2 hours and involved a fair amount of initial resistance and eventual pragmatism on Eli's part, they came to an arrangement. The Collier hands helped build the Crane fence that autumn, and the labor cost was structured as a 3-year note at no interest, which allowed Eli Crane to keep his pride mostly intact while getting his grazing rights preserved. Eli Crane shook Simon's hand at the end of it with a grip that said more than his words did, and he tipped his hat to Myrtle when he passed her in the ranch yard and said, "You have a good one there, Mrs. Collier." And she said, "I know it," because it was simply and exactly true. In 1885, Simon bought the piece of eastern range he had sold during the hard winter year and brought it back into the Collier operation, which was something he had wanted to do since the day he had sold it, and which gave him a visible satisfaction that Myrtle particularly liked to see in him, the completion of something that had been broken. Thomas, who was 5 years old and already horse-mad in the comprehensive way of children who have identified their great passion early, had by this point been formally introduced to Pearl the mare, now retired from trail work and serving as the world's most patient children's horse, and was spending every afternoon in the barn with Abe Weatherford, who had the patient quality of a man who understands that certain children need an adult who will take their interests seriously. Francis, at 2 years old, was already in the garden with Myrtle, sitting in the dirt between the bean rows and conducting various investigations into soil composition and worm behavior that suggested a scientific curiosity that no one on the ranch quite knew how to place, but which everyone agreed was interesting. One evening in the summer of 1885, Simon and Myrtle were sitting on the front porch after the children were in bed. Thomas had required 3 stories and Francis had required one very long and patient conversation about why worms were important, and the night was warm and the stars were out, and the ranch was quiet in the way it got quiet when the day's work was finally completely done. Simon said, "Do you remember what you told me, that first Sunday on the bluff? That you were from nowhere particularly." "I remember," she said. "I have been thinking about that lately." He looked out at the dark prairie. "You are not from nowhere anymore." She followed his gaze out over the grassland, the ranch land, their land, the place that was hers as fully as anything had ever been hers, and felt something settle so deep and so finally that it was almost like silence inside her chest. The permanent settling of a thing that had been loose for a very long time. "No," she said, "I am not." He reached over and took her hand, as he had done 1,000 times in the years they had been married, and she held his hand the way she always did, with the completeness of a person who has learned that being fully held and fully known is not, despite what certain long years had suggested, too much to hope for. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "When I walked into Caldwell with one dress and bare feet and a name I had borrowed," she said, "I thought what I needed was to get through the day. That was the whole of my ambition, just get through the day, find somewhere to sleep, start again tomorrow. I did not let myself think further than that because thinking further than that seemed like a cruelty." He was listening. He always listened this way, with his whole attention, without interruption, as if what she was saying was the thing he most needed to hear. "I did not know," she said, "that what I was walking toward was this. You, the children, this place." She pressed his hand gently. "A name that is actually mine." He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face had that quality she had first seen in the church in Caldwell, the openness, the gladness, the sense of arrival. "Myrtle Collier," he said. "That is my name," she confirmed with a smile that she felt in her whole body. "It is," he said, "and it is the best name in the valley." The years that followed were full and good in the way that the best years are, full not because nothing was difficult, but because the difficulty was met by 2 people who met everything together. In 1887, there was a drought year that cost them a portion of the herd and required the kind of careful financial management that tested everything Myrtle had learned about the ranch's accounts. They got through it by being precise and thoughtful, and by making hard decisions early rather than waiting for things to become catastrophic. Simon's decision to sell the smaller herd section before the summer got worse, rather than holding on in hope, turned out to be exactly right. And when the rains came in late September, they still had enough cattle to rebuild from a solid base. During that summer, in the long evenings when the anxiety about the drought lay over everything like a second heat, they talked about it plainly, not catastrophizing, not minimizing, just facing it honestly together the way they faced most things. There was a night in late July when the situation looked particularly serious, and Myrtle spread the accounts out on the kitchen table after the children were in bed and showed him the 3 possible paths forward with the figures for each one. And Simon looked at the numbers and then looked at her and said, "When I think about what this ranch was before you came, I almost don't recognize it. Not the money part, the thinking part." "We think together," she said. "We do," he agreed. "But you think better." "I think differently," she corrected. "You think with better instincts about the land and the cattle. I think with better instincts about the numbers. That is why it works." He accepted this with the grace of a man who had long since stopped feeling defensive about his partner's strengths. Thomas, in the drought year, was 7 years old and already spending full days with the cattle hands during the summer, which Simon allowed and Abe Weatherford supervised with the dedicated seriousness of a man who considered this part of his responsibilities. The boy had a natural ease with horses that went beyond training. He seemed to understand them the way some people understand languages, with an instinctive fluency that required less teaching and more refinement. By the end of the drought summer, he could saddle and unsaddle Pearl, and 2 of the working horses reliably on his own. And Abe Weatherford delivered this information at the supper table one evening, with the specific satisfaction of a man reporting something genuinely impressive. Frances, at 4 years old, was in the garden every day that the heat allowed, talking to the plants with the earnest and total sincerity of a child who has decided that something is worth doing and sees no reason to do it halfway. In the spring of 1888, when the drought was fully behind them and the herd was rebuilt, and the range was green again after the wet winter, Myrtle found herself in the early mornings sitting on the back porch with her coffee looking at the garden, which by now was something she was genuinely proud of. A sprawling and productive place that fed the ranch household through the winter and provided seeds for other settlers in the area, and was known in a small, informal way throughout the county as the garden at the Collier ranch, and feeling something she had come to recognize as a specific kind of contentment. Not complacency, not the absence of desire or ambition. Something more precise than that. The feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to be doing, with the people who are exactly the right people. It was not a feeling she had ever had before the age of 22. It was not a feeling she had known was possible for someone with her particular history, the borrowed name, the mended dress, the long walk on a dusty Kansas road. She thought about that walk sometimes, with the strange gratitude that distance gives to difficult things. She had walked into Caldwell with nothing, and she had walked out of it with a name and a direction, and a man who treated her like someone worth knowing, and from that everything else had come. Simon found her on the back porch one morning that spring with his coffee in his hand and sat down beside her and looked at the garden she was looking at, and they were comfortable in the way that nearly a decade of mornings will make you comfortable with someone, the ease that is not casualness but intimacy, the difference between the performance of contentment and its reality. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The blue dress," she said. He glanced at her. "The one you came to Caldwell in." "Yes, I was thinking about how I mended it so many times it was barely the original fabric anymore, and how I still have it." She looked at the garden. "I keep it in the cedar chest. I do not know why exactly." "I know why," he said. She looked at him. "Because it is the thing that was yours before anything else was yours," he said. "It is the proof of where you started." She felt the truth of this settle into her. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly why." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and the morning went on around them. The horses moving in the pasture, the early light on the garden, the sound of Thomas beginning to stir in the house, the ranch waking up around them like something that was alive and wholly theirs. In 1889, Danny Prout fell quietly and thoroughly in love with a young woman named Abigail Sears, who had come to work for one of the farming families to the north, and he conducted his courtship with the same earnest seriousness he brought to everything else. Myrtle, who noticed things, noticed this first and mentioned it to Simon one evening in a tone of quiet satisfaction. "He is different lately," she said. "Distracted," Simon agreed. "Not just distracted, hopeful," she said. "It is a specific quality, you can see it." Simon looked at her with amusement. "Can you?" "Yes," she said. "I recognized it because I had it myself once." "When?" he asked, with a knowing look that said he already knew the answer. "In the fall of 1878, she said. "When a man from the valley wrote me 3 letters about thunderstorms and fence repair and managed to make it matter." He smiled at that, the full genuine smile that she had worked in the early days to earn, and which had become, over the years, one of her most reliable pleasures. "Those were good letters," he said. "They were extraordinary letters," she said, definitively. Danny Prout married Abigail Sears in the spring of 1890, and Simon gave them 3 days off from ranch work for a wedding trip to Hutchinson, which was an extravagance that Abe Weatherford considered unreasonably generous and also the correct thing to do. The wedding took place in the small Methodist church in the nearest town, and Myrtle attended and felt something warm and circular about being present at the beginning of something that resembled, in its quiet and genuine quality, the beginning of her own marriage 12 years before. Thomas Collier turned 10 in 1890 and was, by that age, able to work alongside the ranch hands in the lighter cattle work under supervision, which he did with the focused intensity of a child who has found his element entirely. He had Simon's coloring and Myrtle's precision. He was careful with tools, careful with animals, careful with the smaller children who sometimes came to the ranch when neighboring families visited. He had also, to Myrtle's quiet delight, developed an interest in the kitchen garden that he was careful to conduct in a way that maintained his masculine dignity, asking questions about the planting schedule under the pretext of needing to understand the ranch provisions, and then gradually becoming genuinely interested in the growing itself. Frances, at 7, was beginning to read with a fluency and appetite that neither of her parents had entirely anticipated, working through every book on Simon's shelf with a methodical enthusiasm and requesting more. Simon, who was a practical man with a practical man's relationship to books, wrote to a bookseller in Kansas City and ordered a selection that the seller described as appropriate for young readers with broad curiosity, which turned out to be 23 books, which arrived on the supply wagon and were received by Frances with an expression that was the same expression Myrtle had seen on Simon's face the first time he came back to Caldwell in September of 1878. Pure, honest gladness. "She is going to be something," Simon said to Myrtle that evening, watching Frances carry 3 books upstairs with the careful reverence of someone transporting treasure. "She already is something," Myrtle said. "She is specifically Frances Collier, and that is already considerable." He looked at her. "You are good at seeing people," he said. "It is one of the things about you that I noticed first." "What do you mean?" "When you talked about the hands, about Abe, about Danny, you see them the way they actually are, not what they are supposed to be or what is convenient for them to be. What they actually are." He paused. "You saw me that way too, even at the beginning." "I learned it early," she said. "When you are a person with no fixed place, you become very good at reading the people around you. You have to. You need to know who is safe and who is not." He was quiet for a moment. "And what did you see when you read me?" She thought about the man who had stepped into that front room at Hardy's boarding house and said, quietly and completely, "Step outside," who had come back in and said it should not happen, who had written letters about thunderstorms because he wanted to keep talking to her, and a letter was the only way he had. "A person worth knowing," she said, "and then eventually a person I could not imagine not knowing." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held it, and outside the kitchen window the Kansas evening settled into the specific blue that it gets in late summer when the heat is finally lifting, and the day is completing itself. And the garden was dark and full and fragrant, and the horses were quiet in the pasture, and somewhere upstairs Frances was reading about something that mattered to her, and Thomas was asleep with the certainty of a child who knows exactly where he is and what he is for. In the summer of 1891, their 3rd child was born, another boy, whom they named Eli Lawrence Collier, the first name for old Eli Crane, who had died that spring at the age of 75, and who had, in the years since the fence business, become something of a regular presence at the ranch supper table on Sundays. The middle name, as with Thomas, was for Simon's father. Young Eli arrived in July, red-faced and tremendously loud, which was a departure from both of his elder siblings who had been more measured in their initial presentation. He quieted quickly when held and had from the first week a particular responsiveness to music, turning his head toward any sound that had a rhythm to it, which Myrtle noted with the specific wonder that a 3rd child brings, the reminder that each person arrives as themselves, already themselves, from the very beginning. Simon held Eli the first evening with the same expression he had had with Thomas and with Frances, the total openness, the specific gladness, and Myrtle watched him from the bed where she was resting and thought that this was the thing she wanted to remember most clearly about this particular evening. The way he held each child as if they were both miraculous and entirely expected, the way he had always looked at her. Thomas was 11 and took the new baby's existence with big brotherly pragmatism, conducting an inspection and declaring him acceptable before returning to the more important matter of the summer's horse training schedule. Frances, at 8 years old, was enchanted in a way that was entirely Frances. She sat beside the cradle with a book open in her lap and read aloud to baby Eli in a clear, steady voice, her theory being that he should start his literary education immediately, which no one in the household felt equipped to argue with. By the fall of 1891, the Collier ranch was what Simon's mother, if she had lived to see it, would have recognized as the thing she had envisioned when she stood on 40 miles of hard grassland and saw what it could become. It was a working ranch of considerable size, well-managed and well-maintained, with a household that was organized and warm and particular, and a kitchen garden that was the finest in Sumner County, and a family that was the kind of family that makes itself by accumulation, not by declaration, not by sentiment alone, but by the daily choosing of each other and of the work and of the place. Simon rode out most mornings at first light to check the range, the same circuit he had ridden for years, and Myrtle watched him go from the kitchen window as she started the day's breakfast. And when he rode back in the late morning and came through the back door into the kitchen smelling of horses and cold air and the open prairie, she handed him his coffee, and he said something about the range or the cattle or the weather, and she answered. And they were simply together in the way that people are together when the togetherness has become as natural as breathing. In the evenings they still sat on the porch. The conversations had changed in texture from the early years, not in quality, but in the way that conversations change when they have the full weight of a shared life behind them, rather than the careful exploration of new ground. They talked about the children, about the ranch, about the book she was reading and the letter that had come from Beatrice Hardy, who was still in Caldwell at the age of 63 and still running Hardy's boarding house with the same iron efficiency, and was, by Myrtle's observation, one of the genuinely indestructible people of the world. They talked about the small politics of the county, the fence laws and the water rights and the railroad questions that were always somewhere in the background of life in that part of Kansas. They talked about nothing in particular in the easy way of people who have no need to perform their relationship for each other. One evening in the fall of 1892, with the harvest done and the winter provisions laid in and the garden cut back for the season, they sat on the porch in the last warmth of an October evening that smelled of dry grass and distant wood smoke, and Myrtle said, with no particular prelude, "I was thinking about Caldwell today." "What about it?" "The first morning I arrived. Walking down the main street with no shoes, I remember thinking, just get to the end of the street, just that far." He was quiet for a moment, listening. "I had no idea what was on the other side of any of it," she said. "Not even a dream of it, because I had learned by that point not to dream too far ahead because it just made the actual situation harder to bear." "And now?" he asked. She looked at the ranch, the house and the garden and the barn and the pasture and the Cimarron country stretched out beyond it in the fall light, and she felt the particular fullness of a life that had been built from nothing and had become, through work and honesty and love and the willingness to show up, something astonishing. "Now I think I could not have dreamed far enough," she said. Simon looked at her with those quiet eyes that had always seen her exactly as she was, from the very first day in Hardy's boarding house, when she had come in from the laundry with soap on her hands and the register under her arm. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with the attention and the recognition of a man who understood exactly what he had and was grateful for the whole of it. "Neither could I," he said. They sat together as the October evening gathered around them, the stars beginning to appear one by one in the deep sky overhead, the horses quiet in the pasture, the children's voices drifting down from inside the house, Thomas telling Frances something about the horses with the authority of an older brother, Frances disagreeing with the certainty of someone who has read more books than him, and baby Eli somewhere in the middle of it, making his opinions known in his own wordless but emphatic way. Myrtle Collier, who had once been a girl with one mended dress and a borrowed name and bare feet on a dusty road, sat on the porch of the ranch that was hers, beside the man who had given her his name, and in doing so had given her the last thing she needed, and she was home. Not in the temporary way she had been at home in other people's houses and in other people's names. In the permanent way, the way of something built on solid ground and tended daily and loved completely and passed on. She could see this clearly now to the children inside the house and to the life still ahead of them. Years and years of it, solid and certain and entirely theirs. The blue dress was in the cedar chest upstairs. She would keep it there always. The name Collier was on the deed to the land and in the church records, and in the school enrollment papers for Thomas and Francis, and eventually for Eli. And it was on the letters she wrote to Beatrice Hardy and the accounts ledger she kept in the kitchen, and the seed orders she wrote to the nursery in Missouri every January. And it was on her heart in the specific and irrevocable way of the things that are truly, finally, and permanently yours. The richest man in the valley had given her his name, and she had given him the same in return, given it meaning and direction and the warmth of a household that ran like a place where people mattered, and together they had made of it something neither of them could have built alone. Which was, Myrtle thought, looking at the stars coming in over the prairie, exactly the point. Exactly and always the point.